one of the main challenges of the lockdown was that it resulted also in our revenue collections dwindling at a time when the country needed these resources the most. And we had to grapple consistently with how we were going to finance our operations, but at the same time keep the nation moving. So as a government, we created a COVID-19 fund, a kitty that would fund emergency response towards containing the spread, its effects and impacts. But we also said in sharing the burden occasioned by this pandemic, we said we had to lead from the front, and myself as president and the deputy president took an immediate salary cut of 80% of our salaries. Cabinet secretaries, I don't know whether they were happy or not, but I ordered that they take 30% cuts. And principal secretaries and other top officials, we gave them the chance to volunteer to take 20% pay cuts in order to show that commitment and leadership starts at the top. We also called on well-wishers, and in this regard, I really want to thank our Kenyan private sector, because despite the challenges that they themselves were facing, they came out strongly in support to ensure that at least the most vulnerable were able to put food on their tables. This especially because a huge part of our Kenyan workforce was casual. And many of our urban citizens rely on a daily income to sustain themselves. And we recognize this, because those casuals, with many of them now at home as a result of the lockdown, and who depended on that daily income to feed themselves, now had basically no source of income. And the big question became, how could we effectively look after this part of our population? And that, ladies and gentlemen, is how my government came up with the Kazi Mtaani program. And the Kazi Mtaani program was intended to put money in people's pockets in order for them to be able to sustain themselves during that difficult time. In rural areas, people had their small plots and their ngombes and their mbuzis. But in urban areas, this was very difficult. So therefore, unlike what some people tried to indicate that this was a political agenda, it was socially, totally aimed at ensuring that these Kenyans who, through no fault of their own, were unable to go to their places of work, at least would have an opportunity to earn a living and be able to continue to support their families during that most difficult time. The other big question that we had was how some of our industries could continue to produce. Because as you remember, as I said earlier, this was not just a health crisis. It was also a social and economic one. And how we would keep our economy afloat despite this setback. Medical products and supplies were running low, with the entire globe fighting the pandemic, and it became difficult to readily access many products. And once again, I want to thank our private sector because upon consultation, we commissioned our manufacturing industry to begin using their existing lines to make things like ICU beds and units from scratch, to increase oxygen production, to make masks as opposed to T-shirts and other things that they were making for other markets. They started making masks, they started making PPEs, they started making sanitizers, they started making all manner of medical equipment that was to prove critical during this period. And we also realized that the need was growing as the virus was spreading far and wide and in scales that we had not witnessed, that without, once again, the help of private sector, we would not have been able to keep the deaths to the levels that they were. We were further, as a result of that initiative, able to increase our ICU beds from, at the time, 537 to 1,353 ICU beds, a good number of those made by our local manufacturers, giving those infected by the virus a fighting chance. We were also able to build many physical isolation units, and we could transform, and as again Amit has said, some hotels and others graciously gave us access and schools to their facilities, which could be transformed into isolation centers that were affordable to the average Kenyan. Secondly, I've mentioned that we also introduced a stimulus package, and I've mentioned about Kazi Mtaani and where it came to. But we also realized we had to increase from those, especially civil servants and others, and the average Kenyan worker. We realized that we also needed to increase their disposable income during this difficult time. And we came up with measures such as, for all those earning 24,000 shillings and less, we released and relieved them from tax deductions, VAT, pay as you earn, and such other things to Kaondoa, so that people would have more disposable income. We reduced our VAT by 2%, just to mention but a few of the actions that we took to help ease the pressure on Kenyans. And by the way, I must also recall that the Kazi Mtaani program went a long way, not only to help provide an income for